Forgiveness means you understand their perspective. Not agree, not approve, understand. And there's a huge difference there. Forgiveness is understanding. That's really all it is.
Hey, my friend, welcome back to the USU podcast. I want to give you a little heads up. This conversation went way, 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 way deep in the spiritual pool. I'm talking no shallow waters here. If you've been asking yourself, how do I balance my energy? How do I deal with all of the shadow work and strife and what's going on in the world? Or if you're in the US, in our country, how do I stay in a place of equanimity and how do I have inner peace? How do I uplift the consciousness of humanity, of others? How do I shine my light and make an impact? How can I be a blessing in my life and in others' lives? If those are some of the questions you're asking yourself, listen up. This conversation, I know it's a little longer than it typically goes. I purposely did not want to cut it off at any point. I had a hard time cutting it when we did, but we went really, really deep into some of the most profound spiritual teachings from A Course in Miracles, the Law of One, the raw material, Jesus's teachings, as well as some of Aaron's teachings around spiritual intelligence, around your chakras, your energy, the most important way that you can heal everything and anything in your life. I'm not going to give it away, but we went way into that. And how to create more joy and peace and balance, and how when you do that, how we can do that as a whole for this planet. So if that is speaking to you, if those are some of the questions that you have been wondering, put on your seatbelt, my friend. You are in for a fantastic ride. So honored to bring Aaron Abke, spiritual teacher, wisdom keeper, soul brother, and part of this beautiful team of light. May you remember you are part of this great light expansion. And I'm so honored to be here in your earbuds, or if you're watching, part of your life, and sending you so much love. Enjoy. Aaron, you are such a gift. And before we dive in, you know me, I like to bring in the divine, set an intention. So I'm just going to invite us, and this is going to be something everyone can tune into. I'm going to put my hand on my heart, and you can already feel the high energy around you and around this conversation. And take a few breaths. Just ask the all-loving, great one, creator of all of us, to speak through you, through me, as an instrument of greater peace, love, oneness, unity, compassion, possibility. May everything that is shared in this conversation be a blessing for all of our beautiful community members, near and far, throughout the globe, knowing we are one, always one. From my heart to yours, thank you and namaste. If you want to add anything.
Father, Mother, God, we're so grateful to be able to have these amazing conversations where we know you show up and you love to flow through these conversations and do your work in us, God. So we welcome you. We invite your presence with us, and we allow you to guide this conversation wherever you desire it to go, God, for the highest good of all listening. And we thank you.
So it is.
And so it is.
Woo! Okay. Well, we're diving into the deep end of the spiritual pool. Let's just go there, my brother.
No shallow end in my pool, Julie.
Thank God. That's why you're back over and over again. People know, like, we don't do shallow end here. You do not do shallow end. So let's kick it off. I'm gonna hand you a little bit of a softball first, and then we're gonna move into
warm me up.
Warm you up. I didn't even play baseball, but I think that's what would happen. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So spiritual intelligence, I think this is a good place to start for all of us. When you talk about spiritual intelligence, can you share a little bit about what does that mean? How do we connect to it? How does it differ from left brain, IQ? Like, what are we talking about with spiritual intelligence?
Yeah, spiritual intelligence is not an easy thing to define, because when you hear the word intelligence, you typically think right away about, linear intelligence or something. And it's a very non-linear intelligence, because it pertains to your awareness and your comprehension of reality. So how do you define that? And the way that I like to define it that makes the most sense for me is that spiritual intelligence is the combination of your self-awareness and your embodiment or your integration of your self-awareness. So you have masculine and feminine, which would be left and right brain. And the way that that happens, you guys know I love Law of One and all the teachings that come from the Law of One. The Law of One helped me to understand what real spiritual intelligence is, which in one way we could say is your ability to comprehend the lessons and catalysts that life is sending you and what they mean and what their purpose is. So that requires self-awareness and embodiment. So what Ra teaches happens is that when they call it a catalyst in the Law of One, which means like an experience. Every experience is a catalyst for our growth and expansion. So when a catalyst, when we encounter a catalyst or vice versa, Ra says that the catalytic energy first is met by the root chakra. And the root chakra is always the first energy center that gets a chance to process an experience. And that is for our primal survival instincts and protection. So if you have an unbalanced root chakra, we have a society today that has very blocked root chakras because everything is, you're hyper sensitive. Everything is triggering, puts you into a fight or flight state, a defensive state. And so your red ray energy center is becoming like a block to that energy from moving any higher up the energy centers. So somebody who has a very somebody who has a very blocked root chakra would have a very low level of spiritual intelligence, not because they have any less potential for it. We all have the same potential for SQ. It's because the energy isn't being allowed to go past the first chakra because it's putting them into that animal primal fight or flight state. Everything's scary. Everything provokes a fear state or resistance. So you've got to find grounding and balance and inner peace to allow experiences to move up the chakra network. And the higher up they go, it's almost like the momentum gets slowed down at each energy center based on how open or blocked somebody is. So the point of opening our energy centers is to become more spiritually intelligent, that we can become more self-aware, and then we can actually embody that awareness into a living expression of being a new being, right? Because it's very possible to like be aware that you have certain imbalances. Like I'm aware that I always just talk over top of people. You know, I do have that tendency. But then if you're not like radically doing something about it and striving to make that awareness allow you to be a more calm, still, patient person who can listen more than speak, then you haven't really embodied the awareness yet. So it hasn't actually raised your SQ yet. So you need the awareness of the issue before you can raise your SQ. But in my estimation, at least, your actual SQ value, and I do have like a chart with all the chakras that give point values, just like arbitrary as a way to measure your progress. Your SQ points don't actually rise until that awareness becomes embodied. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you actually, I was like, he is reading my mind. We'll go to this question in a little bit. So we're looking at the self, and then we're going to look at all of the selves and what that does for the collective, because I do want to talk about, especially, you know, being in the US and what's happening. So the awareness, embodiment, if you're cool, that let's move up. So we start with the root, the foundation, fear, anxiety, if there's a block there. Now, let's say somebody is open in their root, open in their sacral, and blocked in their solar plexus. So let's talk about how to open these different chakras and how that shifts your SQ.
I would love to, in fact.
Great.
It's my favorite subject.
Me too. Yay.
If you want, I can actually share my screen and show you the SQ chart. That maybe will give like a visual, example of what we're actually talking about. Nice. So this is the SQ chart in a nutshell. And as you see, each level of SQ correlates to an energy center. And I've named it something that correlates to how you might describe that person's level of spiritual development. So if somebody's SQ is 50 points or less, that is anything under 50 SQ points or below is the realm of insanity, right? So this is people that are murdering, drug addicted, maybe in psych wards, just committing all of the worst crimes of humanity happen at this level, extremely, extremely blocked and imbalanced. And unaware of self. At the sacral level, it's called ignorance because this is the level where most human beings are, around that 50 to 75 SQ point range. And it's called ignorance because, you can live in society and be a normal functioning adult at this level. At the insanity level, you can't really be a normal functioning adult in the world because you have so many distortions and imbalances, drug addictions, this or that. Like your life's going to blow up over and over again. You're not able to really have a stable life yet. But at that ignorance level, like you're living in the matrix world like everybody else, everyone would look at you and say, there's a normal adult, member of society. But on the inside, you're very spiritually bankrupt still. You're very unaware of self still. You're very ignorant of who you are and what the universe is. And that's what we consider normal in today's world. Above that is the solar plexus level of empowerment. And this is where somebody starts getting more interested in philosophy and spirituality, and usually getting very interested in law of attraction teachings. So this would be the level where somebody gets really interested in, I'm going to create my own reality, make my own life, like personal ambition, personal willpower really comes online at that level. But at a certain point, that will lead somebody to a spiritual awakening. So when they pass over the 100 SQ points into the 101 to 125 range, that's the heart chakra range, which I call the awakening level of SQ. And this is where somebody's in a full-blown spiritual awakening, meaning they are aware that they are not just the body, they are an eternal soul, a spirit, and that the universe is created by a creator, and they are one with that creator, and they're striving to grow spiritually and all of that, heal their traumas. That all takes place in that 101 to 125 range. From 126 to 150 is where we get into the illumination level. And at the 150 level or above, well, you could consider that enlightenment or illumination. The throat chakra kind of correlates to the wisdom density of consciousness, where we start to really tune into the nature of self, the nature of consciousness, the metaphysics of the universe, the laws of the universe, and we start to really abide by the laws of the universe and become hyper aware of them such that we really can't infringe on them anymore. And so much of the personal sense of self has been transcended. So I could go up from there, but that gives you an idea of how the progression works. And so you see on that left-hand side, I have, and this is just one chart I use in different presentations, but the higher up we move in SQ, the more our consciousness is merging with the universal mind, which means we less and less feel like a individual personal self, and vice versa. The lower we go in SQ, the more we feel estranged from the universe and God, the universal mind, and the more we feel like an individual person. And that's kind of where we live. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. So I can't remember what your initial question was. I think you asked about the solar plexus or something, but now that we have the overview, we can dive in a little deeper.
Yeah. And I think, first of all, awesome. Love visuals. And, I'm thinking about having worked through A Course in Miracles. We've talked a lot about that, you and I here at the Law of One, but let's take ACIM for a minute, because what I'm realizing is those day-to-day lessons, what it was so helpful having the diagram what I'm sensing is it's really helping each of us, anyone who studies and lives Course in Miracles, go from the 50, right? The insanity, even the ignorance, to I would assert throat chakra, hopefully even beyond third eye. And so are you, I guess, how can somebody, maybe they haven't studied A Course in Miracles, maybe they haven't read The Law of One, which, by the way, I really recommend both, although it's not simple reading. Let me just say that.
Yeah. You're going to have to go through it a few times.
I'm still like, what? Hold on. Let me go back. How would I know anybody who's here? Look, like attracts like. Anyone who's here, Erin, is going to, I hear the question, how do I move up? How do I get unblocked? If it's in my solar plexus, if it's in my heart, what can we do individually? We'll start with the individual level. How can we block ourselves in the chakra energy fields so that we're moving up more towards enlightenment and illumination?
And that is the question. How do we raise our SQ?
That's right.
So, well, first of all, I have what I call the SQ test for each energy center. And the way I've designed it is that it's a self-assessment. So every energy center, I've boiled it down to the 5 main qualities of that energy center. And now I know we're getting a little bit nerdy here, but this is what you brought me on the podcast for, right?
We love nerdy.
The lower three energy centers, the root, sacral, and solar plexus, are the only energy centers that actually have blockages in them or that get blocked. In the spiritual space or world, we hear people say, oh, my heart chakra is blocked, or I have a big blockage in my throat chakra. And it's like, that's kind of relatively true. But the actual like metaphysical truth is that those chakras do not contain blockages in and of themselves, but they close off to energies that do not match their native frequency. So if you have negative energy from the lower three chakras, like unworthiness or lack of self-confidence, then yes, when that energy is flowing up the chakra network and it hits the throat chakra represents authenticity and truthful communication and inner wisdom. So it's going to not open, like it can't process self-devaluation and unworthiness and those kinds of energies. So you won't be able to fully speak your truth, right? Because you got to balance those energies first. And then the throat chakra will open and allow you to express the true qualities of the throat chakra. So the lower three are the ones that we have to balance. And this is something that Ra stresses in the Law of One over and over and over, almost to a degree where it's like funny because they'll be asking different questions about like, tell us how UFOs work. And like, do they use gravity propulsion or the slingshot method? And Ra's like, they use the slingshot method. But let us not forget that the purpose of third density is balancing the lower three energy centers. You know, they just try to keep interjecting it like, you're really asking us the wrong questions. You should be asking us how to balance your lower three chakras, because that's how you get out of this density type of thing. So we got to balance those lower three. But with the upper three, the heart, throat, and third eye, we have to focus on activating those centers and pulling the latent gifts and abilities out of them to call upon them and draw upon them. So lower three is balancing, upper three is activating, doing spiritual work in those chakras, if that makes sense. And so when we talk about how do I raise my SQ, until you have really worked on balancing the lower three, you have no business trying to activate your third eye and the upper three chakras, because they're closed to the degree that your lower three are blocked. So it's going to be really hard to do deep spiritual work in the upper chakras if you're all bound up and blocked in the lower three. And so in the lower three, it's really ACIM stuff, right? It's forgiveness, love, see God in everything. Don't be defensive, hold nothing against anyone. It's all about forgiveness. And that's because forgiveness is what activates and allows us to get into the heart. Only the heart can forgive, because the ego is fully incapable of that action, right? Ego wants to judge and hold everything against everybody. So by practicing forgiveness, which is the most challenging spiritual practice probably of all, that's also because it gives us the most bang for our buck, right? The hardest practices produce the most fruits.
Okay, so there's so many questions. I'm gonna contain myself. So we're talking about SQ, and what you're saying is before you can even activate the top three, you must, it's like you can't spiritually bypass, you can't bypass the first three. And I've experienced this personally, and I feel this to be true. And love the reminder for anyone who hopefully ventures to read the Law of One. I remember that, like, you should be focusing there. So let's talk about balancing. We're talking about forgiveness, and what's coming to mind, balancing our lower three. And I want to look at how we do that individually, and then the power of when we do that individually, how can that shift the collective? What do you see? We'll start with the self, and then I want to look at the collective, what's happening with the attacking and the lack of forgiveness. And I think looking at through A Course in Miracles is such a great lens. I know many people who've read through it or worked through it, and forgiveness is not easy, Erin, especially when we're not even aware our ego is, we're looking through our ego's eyes, and it can feel like, no, I really was wronged, or that person really did something that was offensive, or So let's talk about forgiveness a little bit more. My sense is that that's kind of the pivotal point with balancing. Let's go into that.
Mm-hmm.
Your perspective, how we do that.
Yeah, it really is the central key to all spiritual balance because, we showed the chart of universal mind versus individual mind. Judgments keep us really locked in the individual perspective and out of the universal perspective where freedom and happiness actually live. So, like, here's one thing that really helps me to teach the practice of forgiveness. In the Law of One, it's called spiritual balancing. And Ra describes it. It's a very interesting way to describe forgiveness. And Ra doesn't say, like, this is essentially forgiveness, but Ra goes on to talk about forgiveness quite a bit. And it's like exactly the way that they explain the practice of spiritual balancing. So it's this idea that we have all these perspectives available to us that we can adopt. And when we get really locked in one perspective, that's when we develop judgments towards other perspectives. So forgiveness is like the ability to be able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand their perspective such that it loses its charge for you. So we use the word polarity and being polarized. In terms of a perspective, the more that you hang on to a certain perspective and say, this one perspective is the right perspective, it's the true perspective, that means you have to perceive all others as wrong and bad perspectives. So you're becoming more polarized against all other points of view, which means you're going to feel very angry, harsh, negative feelings towards everyone else, and judgments will rule your mind, right? So it's a very bad position to be in because it's a very ego strengthening position, right? So what you want to do is depolarize your mind's perspective by considering its opposite or its antithesis. So Ra talks about balancing every perspective, literally every perspective possible, with its antithesis. And something that religion instills in people is this kind of fear of exploring other perspectives, right? I was told, as I'm sure you were told, like, don't ever read a New Age text or listen to a New Age teacher. It's all evil, demonic stuff, and the devil's going to suck you into that perspective, and you're going to get lost. It's very dangerous to explore other teachings. And it shows the level of insecurity about your own teaching, first of all. But second of all, it's a total lie and a total strategy of the ego to keep people from healing and balancing their mind. Because the truth is, you have to consider every possible perspective and understand it. So here's the caveat, is that to understand somebody's perspective does not mean you agree with it. And we're not trying, like when we do spiritual balancing work, let's say I've been abused and I've been holding this trauma in my body for 20 years. And I'm like, okay, I really want to forgive my abuser, but God, how am I even going to do that? How could I forgive them for such an evil act? Well, it's because you think forgiving them means you have to agree with them, that it's okay they did it. You're almost approving of the fact that they did it. All incorrect. That is not what forgiveness means. Forgiveness means you understand their perspective. Not agree, not approve, understand. And there's a huge difference there. Forgiveness is understanding. That's really all it is. So if I'm going to forgive my abuser, I have to actually let myself mentally explore my abuser's perspective of, what could drive somebody to do something like abuse a child? What would it have to take for me to abuse a child? And you can just consider that and say, well, I would have to have been abused myself for sure. I would have to have been hurt really deeply in my life. And when you allow yourself permission to explore what would make me a child abuser, most people say, oh, I'll never consider that. Well, then it's always going to be a blockage, isn't it? You're afraid of it. You're in resistance to it. It's negative energy stuck in your body. So you have to now project that negative energy of the child abuser out of you and hate child abusers and you evil people. But it's really because you cannot accept the child abuser in yourself, the potential, right? That, yeah, you could have been hurt enough in your life and abused enough in your life that you might do that to a kid yourself someday. Happens to millions of people, right? So by actually releasing my resistance to the potential in me that could become a child abuser, now I can explore and say, oh yeah, I can actually see that. And then you can say, I wonder if they went through things like that. And of course they did, right? Nobody just pops out of the womb as an innate child abuser. People become that way. They become conditioned that way. Maybe they grew up in a satanic cult or something. Maybe they were abused tremendously, but something made them into that because all pain has to be offloaded onto others. That's what the ego does. Ego can't keep pain to itself and say, oh, I'll just hold this pain inside and just keep it to myself. It has to leak out, it has to be projected out. And so hurt people hurt people. So now I'm like, oh, I actually understand why my abuser abused me. They were a person full of pain and trauma. They probably were sexually abused themselves. And all of a sudden, you just come to this balanced understanding. I don't approve of their abuse and I don't agree with it, but I understand it. And so now it's lost its charge. So I've been in my perspective for 30 years, but now I've allowed myself to be in their perspective and I understand it. And so now the two perspectives meet, they become depolarized and they lose their charge. And we could call that forgiveness if you want, because that's what it is. Ra calls it spiritual balancing, but it's coming to acceptance in the heart that at the core of what we are, everyone is the same. Everyone is good. Everyone is God. Everyone has divine light. But many of these divine brothers and sisters of mine are living very tough lifetimes, and they're being abused, they're being hurt. And so then they act out that abuse. So, like, why judge all of that? Why hate that? Why add more negative energy to it? I want to heal abusers, so there's no more abuse. I want to heal murderers, so there's no more murder, right? And if I judge it and hate it in my mind, I contribute to it, I create it, right? So when you see that forgiveness is individual and collective healing, you feel a lot of impetus to be a forgiving person and say, I'm just going to not hold anyone's trespasses against them. As Jesus said, I want to only contribute light to this planet because I don't agree with child abuse and I don't want it to go on. I will not judge it any longer. I will forgive it and understand it. And suddenly there's one less person adding that negative energy to the planet. It's the big time spiritual work.
What you're talking about is so core and essential, I think, to what we're seeing in our world, in our country, especially right now. And this is why and my heart is like, I'm so happy you're here. I'm so glad we're talking about this. Anyone listening right now, I know you're here as a light worker. I know that anyone listening is here to be that lamppost, to be that, as I think Rumi said, right? Be the lifeboat, be the lamppost, be the ladder. It's interesting. I'm thinking about the essence of understanding. Actually, the precursor, Aaron, wouldn't you say, is curiosity, which has zero attachment. To me, curiosity has that 0 point polarity. And so we can get curious. I will say, if I can add just a little thing about this, because I've always been very good at being curious and trying to understand. And one of the areas I didn't really do well with that I've been working on is, but not to negate my feelings, right? So we want my senses to do both, right? To take care of our feelings and process them and to have this understanding. And you said it, this is so important about forgiveness. This is the piece I think people miss. I have to remind myself of is it's not that we are pardoning or saying it's okay what you did. It's coming from a place of maybe curiosity and then getting a sense and understanding. And one thing when I do these interviews at the end, I usually say, can you share a heart flare? And the image I saw, Aaron, was really, we almost need to see anybody that has been an abuser or hurt others, and we may be them at times, is there's a flare of pain. It's like someone's holding a sign saying, I'm hurt, I'm in pain. And to understand that, you said it, hurting people hurt others. If you are doing this balancing work, I've experienced this in my life. So really appreciate what you're saying, because to me, this is the work, is this kind of forgiveness. And let's talk about with people you don't agree with, you don't connect with, you don't have the political views with. And, we're about to head into an election time, and not to get too far down that rabbit hole, but there are many different voices. I just recently was watching an interesting conversation on TV. I don't watch a lot of the news, and I'm like, wow, there are some hurt people. There are some hurt ass people here. How can we real time use this forgiveness, whether it's in the political arena, whether it's dealing with your own pain, or just feeling that, there's a lot of strife out there. Like, I guess to talk even like practically, how do you recommend putting this into practice?
Yeah, the realm of politics is an especially good one for practicing spiritual balancing. And like again, that ability to really put yourself in the shoes of the antithesis of your position. Like really, like if you're on the right, really imagine what it's like to be a leftist. You know what I mean? Let yourself live there in your mind a bit and say, what would make me into a radical leftist? And you can start understanding why some people are drawn to that. And again, like every position in the universe, every perspective is correct from the position they're looking from. Yeah.
Right.
It seems true to them, or they wouldn't be in that position. You know what I mean? No one stays in a perspective they know is not true. So like that's why judging and hating other people for a different perspective is totally ridiculous and futile. It's like, well, look, you can argue all day long that they're wrong, but they don't think they are. So they've got to come to the conclusion of, hey, I don't think this is the right position or the right perspective. So like whether it's left or right, or like carnivores and vegans, whatever the polarities are. Like if you ask a vegan about carnivores, they'll say, hey, why do you think people eat carnivore? Well, because they're a bunch of soulless, heartless, evil, cruel animals, that just love killing animals. So, okay, interesting. Do you think carnivores see themselves that way? Like if I ask a carnivore, hey, why do you eat the carnivore diet? Well, because I'm a psychopath who loves killing animals, That's obviously not their perspective. So what use is it for me to judge them as that when they don't think they're that? So instead, it's like, let me actually put myself in the position of a person who eats the carnivore diet. And yes, I think it's very evil to kill animals and eat them, but they clearly don't. So why would I be able to eat animals and not think it's evil? Okay. And then you start to consider that perspective, and it just loses its charge once you do that. You say, oh, I get it. I don't agree, but I get it. We can do that with left versus right, conservative, liberal. Like we need to understand one another in this country. And I find it very interesting how, and I guess like this makes sense because I'm a spiritual teacher. So this is where I live, as well as you and most people listening. But I just find it so bizarre that with the extremely polarized social environment we have in this country of left versus right, where like we're all of the same country, we're all Americans, and we're all human beings. We have way more things that unite us than divide us, like 100 times more things that unite us. We all really want the same things at the end of the day. And we're living under the same governmental system in the same country. So you'd think we would all have our number one priority to create a harmonious society that we all can live in. But it's like, no. The number one priority by far is being right and proving my point and getting my point across. So you have like left and right attacking each other constantly, literally like trying to get each other thrown in jail. Every bill the right passes, the left vetoes, and vice versa. And infighting like this is not only considered normal, but it's like people love it and they encourage it. And I'm over here thinking like, if unity amongst one another is not a politician's number one priority, I would vote them out immediately. You know what I mean? We should not want or tolerate politicians who are like, I'm here to take down the right, or I'm here to take down the left. But it's like, I guess everybody just wants a constant food fight and a horribly divided society, because it's like everyone loves this divisive politicians that only ever talk bad about the other side. But it's like, but we're on the same team. It's like if a football team, like the offensive players and the defensive players just hated each other and we're always fighting in the locker room. It's like, you guys think we're going to win any football games? It's like, should be obvious to everybody. You cannot have a house divided like this. When people are like, yeah, down with the left or down with the right. It is very bizarre to me from the SQ I'm looking from. But nevertheless, that's where the collective consciousness is, in those lower two, like red and orange ray energy centers, where it's all about fighting and being right. So, all we can do ourselves really is not participate in that stuff, and to really do the spiritual work to become a being of love and unity, because we create so much energy on the planet when we vibrate at that frequency. And, the Hawkins scale is a great depictor of this, that like one person who reaches that 500 level of the heart on the Hawkins scale, will be calibrating at like, or producing like 650,000 points of energy versus like one person underneath 200 is barely putting out any, right? So I think it's a person living from the heart level is putting out as much energy as 650,000 people below the 200 level. So we're talking about like exponentially, every energy center is exponential than the previous one. So like we really do more good than we can possibly realize just by being in our heart, living from heart-based consciousness. But from there, our actions in the world will be a lot more powerful as well.
You are in my sphere. Literally, one of the questions, I'm like, we are very synced because I was going to ask you, my understanding is one person tuned in to their heart energy is way more powerful than hundreds of thousands that are not. And this is part of, and I'm so passionate about this. I can feel my body is like vibrating. This is my call to action to everyone listening. This is why I love you and I want you here. And we're talking about this. This is so important. This really, to me, is everything, because every person, whether you're in the US or I'm with people all over the world, doesn't matter. You getting the work of forgiveness, of letting go of judgment, of balancing the lower three, of moving up and activating the higher three, you are more powerful than hundreds of thousands that are not awake yet, which, I think of it like, I've seen it like a mirror ball, like a, what do you call those? Like, the disco balls, the disco ball.
Yes.
Like each of us being a tiny little aspect, like And I love what you said. This is important because our ego is going to say, no, I'm right. And everyone thinks everyone's right in a way.
Everyone's right.
Everyone's right, which I'm even getting, Aaron, and I don't know, you've said this about energy. When you're talking this forgiveness work, I would imagine on an energetic level, it's neutralizing, when we make attacks and judge, it's attacking ourselves. So I saw this physically when I was married to a really good person, and I really didn't feel like I was speaking up. I didn't feel like I was fully self-expressed. And I am still healing. My thyroid is on its way of being fully healed, but it's been healing from that. Part of my medicine is to speak like this with you. And I felt it. I knew it intuitively. And so I think there's something for us to understand what is the physical apparatus, what do they call
Mind,
it?
body, spirit complex.
Mind, body, spirit complex.
Yeah.
Everything's intertwined. So this is also good for your health. This is good for the world. Like there's so many positive outplays of this when you forget.
That's why it's important for people to understand forgiveness doesn't mean I fully approve of the actions of the people that hurt me. Because they'll always hold resistance to doing the real work that's really going to save them and the world at large. They'll hold resistance against that because it's like, I'm still not willing to trade my own peace of mind and the planetary healing work for accepting that my abuser's actions were okay. It's like, we're not saying they're okay. It's never, ever okay to hurt someone else. The law of one is the law of do no harm. That is the one law. When Jesus was asked this, Lord, what is the greatest commandment of all? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. So AKA do no harm, right? You would never willingly want to harm yourself, which means you can never harm someone else and obey the law at the same time. So it's always a deviation from God's law, the law of one, to do harm. So it's never, ever approving of doing harm to forgive someone. It's saying, I understand why a person could do that because of the pain, the negative energy, the trauma they're holding. So I don't hold their pain against them any longer. And by doing that, I set myself free, as you said, from the negative energy I'm holding in my body. Because guess what? Judgment, resentment, fear, hatred is negative energy. So it's being held in your body and you think you're holding it against their body, but you're not. They may abuse you and move on and never think about you again, for all you know. You can't harm somebody else with your own judgmental thoughts unless they agree with them. So like, if I understand that judgment is really me playing God, right? I know who you really are and what you're worth. If I'm playing God, and the analogy is always that God's judgment is like a lightning bolt that strikes somebody. If I'm playing God and I'm judging people in my mind, the lightning bolt of judgment has to pass through my body first before I can send it out, because I'm the source of the judgment. So I create the negative energy that I attempt to project. But as we know, you can't ever really separate yourself from any mind creation. Any thought you think, you can never be separate from that thought. All you can do is heal it and transmute it, but you can't separate from it. So every negative thought you hold gets trapped in your body. It will proliferate at some point into a disease of some sort if it's not forgiven. So it's like when you understand these consequences, the metaphysical consequences of holding negative energy in your body, you're like, teach me how to forgive. I'm ready to start today. You know, all of a sudden you have a great motivation to do the work.
I love what you just said. I want to say two things. One, I want to look at judgment of yourself. I want to talk about self-attack, because I think that's the other side of the coin that certainly for me, that's been one of the biggest areas to really learn how to heal. Also, as somebody who's been in the 12-step world for a lot of my life, I want to say that channeled work gets to a lot of this too, because people come in, whether it's Course in Miracles, there's many, many ways to get into forgiveness. I found it through Course in Miracles, 12, there's many avenues, right? There's many roads to healing, many roads.
Thank goodness.
Thank goodness. This might be a little bit, I don't know, people may not agree with this as you were talking, and I don't know your thoughts on this, Aaron. My belief system, at least what feels true to me, is that the all-loving Mother, Father, Great Spirit, God actually doesn't judge. It is an all-loving energy that I actually think part of us feeling alone and so scared is we can't even comprehend or sense the amount of love that is there for us. Like, I try to think of it as a pie chart. I think it's like below 1%. And if we could just even tap into that great love, I'd be curious your thoughts. That's just my belief, is it doesn't judge. So even to think we're playing God, it's like, but do you know? And this is my, people may disagree, and that's okay too. I don't believe the all-loving Supreme Creator is actually even judging. I think it's only loving. I really do.
God has no ability to judge. It's something God couldn't do if God wanted to. But I only say that because judgment is an illusion, right? Judgment doesn't actually exist. There's no truth or substance behind judgment other than ignorance and blindness. And because God knows everything, God is incapable of judgment. And God has no concept of forgiveness.
Right.
Right? Even A Course in Miracles says this. It says, like, forgiveness is unknown in heaven, where the need for it would be inconceivable. Because you got to judge before you forgive, and God can't judge, so God also can't forgive. God is perfect, infinite, unconditional love. And that's because God holds every perspective in the universe. So, like, again, reality is proof of what's true. If there is a child abuser on planet Earth acting out child abuse, which we all say that's the most heinous thing, unforgivable thing. Well, guess what? At least one person doesn't think so, right? So there is a perspective available in the universe where child abuse seems okay. And like, yes, they're suppressing their conscience and all these things, right? You have to go down a very long, slippery slope to get to the point where you're abusing children, right? You've been addicted to pornography and violence and all these things and kink for decades. Like, you have to go down the slope to get to that perspective. So I'm not saying a child abuser doesn't have to suppress their conscience and morality. Of course they do. But like, from their perspective of intense suppression and like, I've been hurt so much, so what is it to me to hurt others? Like, life has been unfair to me, so I should be unfair back, you know? That's a perspective, right? And it's not the true perspective, but it is one that can seem convincing from its own position. So once we realize, well, obviously the murderer kills because they think murder's okay. The thief steals because they think stealing is okay. Like, then it loses the charge for us, and we just say, all right, how do we heal it? You know, how do we help somebody out of that perspective? And it's through unconditional love, non-judgment, and forgiveness. That energy alone can rehabilitate somebody and has just tremendous power to heal and rehabilitate people, because the Course in Miracles says all acts of insanity, all acts of harm, of evil, they're nothing but cries for help. Their cries for love, like I'm lost in such a dark position that I need someone to save me. I can't save myself. And it's very sad that we don't hear that cry for help. We hear just an evil person who deserves hatred and all that stuff. And so we just drive them further into that position. So again, it's like the universe is proof of its own laws. If someone believes that or does that, they think it's valid. So they need to be shown otherwise. And you can't show somebody otherwise if you're busy judging them and pointing the finger at them. All that does is reinforce the position, right? What you fight, you strengthen. What you resist will persist.
Hey, my love, it's Julie. I just wanted to pop in here really quickly to share something very exciting for you. Being a part of this beautiful USU podcast family, I wanted to share a special that I have going right now. I am opening the doors now to my intuition school. This is going to help you to really learn how to use your intuition as your inner GPS. Your intuition is literally your superpower. It has healed and changed my life, and I want to help you to do the same. Go to juliereisler.com/intuition school and use the code podcast97 to get $97 off of tuition. So here's the thing. There are 9 modules. I'm going to teach it to you live every week. You have everything recorded. We're going to dive deep. All things woo, wisdom of oneness, as you know, learning how to muscle test, learning how to connect with your spirit guides, your higher self, learning how to assess your energy system and your chakras, and so much more. Go check it out at juliereisler.com/intuition school. And if your soul is feeling a calling, a nudge to do this, be sure to use the special code podcast97. I would love to have you there. I'd be honored to be part of your journey in activating your most powerful asset, your intuition. Sending love always. I hope to see you there. Well said. People take notes. We'll have notes too. I just went to my acupuncturist yesterday. She was actually, I was so lucky. She is about to turn close to 80. She started a acupuncture school in the East Coast, one of the first ones. Just a beautiful soul. She knows the Course in Miracles. And we were talking and she said, Julie, look at my bracelet. It says badass. I'm a badass. And I said, oh, Diane, you are a badass. She said, no. Do you know why I'm a badass? And I said, tell me. I know I can probably give you a lot of reasons. She said, I'm a badass because one of her, she calls patients her beloveds. My beloved gave this to me. And she said, because I'm choosing to show up in the world as love and I'm meeting every soul that I see and greeting them with love, no matter who they are. And that's badassery. And I was like, sister, everybody needs that bracelet. And I think one of the things to look at, I'd love to look at with you, because I know from a lot of the comments is, so when we've been doing this to ourselves, when we've been attacking ourselves, I personally believe autoimmune conditions, things like that are super connected to self-esteem.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And as somebody who's healing from that, I am like on a mission for us to heal our relationship with ourselves. You mentioned it, but I want to talk about it. Unconditional love. How do we practically do that? And then we are going to move into some of our favorite teachings from Jesus, because I'm already hearing it's time to bring him in soon.
Bring in the Christ.
Yeah, I'm like, Christ consciousness is like, woo, I'm feeling the golden glow around us.
Always. Yes.
And maybe that's a great segue. I do want to talk about, though, the relationship with ourselves, because that can sometimes be, it's very easy. Okay, I'm going to work on this relationship and that one. I'm going to work on forgiving. With ourselves, though, I actually think it's probably one of the most important relationships we can work on.
Mm-hmm. Yep. The most important. You cannot give away something you don't have. So if you don't have love for yourself, then you don't have any love for anyone else either. All of the judgmental thoughts you hold about yourself must be projected out to others. And we gave an example of that, of like whatever you hate in someone else, you hate that in yourself, really, right? You don't have room to accept that in yourself. Your ego wants to flatter you to think that you're better than that. You don't have that potential in you. You could never become an abuser like they are. They're beneath you. They're more evil and you're more good. And so you don't want to face the potential that you could have ended up in any one of these positions in your life. Like if you had lived the exact lifetime as that person, you would behave and act and think exactly as they do. Sorry, like it's just true. Tough pill to swallow for ego.
Yeah.
So
Can I ask you
when it comes,
before
yeah,
that?
yeah, yeah.
Because what I'm hearing and want to just say is, for anyone listening, it doesn't have to be as extreme as that. It could be, your mother. I know with my mom, high anxiety, I was really effing triggered around her. Like, what with your crazy calling me 10 times and your anxiety. And I realized it scared the shit out of me because I saw, oh my God, I think I have anxiety and I'm scared of being, so I just, to bring it, because child abuser, obviously that's a whole other category, but I have a feeling many people tuning in, there's like those levels of things that you're dealing with, that you're seeing, that you're scared of, that could show up like that in your partner, in your parent, and a friend, and somebody else. So I just wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because they are showing up everywhere. The reason I like to always lead with the most extreme example is because that's always the rebuttal in people's minds. If I begin with saying like impatience or something more subtle like that, people will be like, okay, yeah, I can see how I project impatience onto people. But don't tell me I'm projecting child abuse onto people. That's ridiculous. I would never abuse a child. So it's like, but let's see how you would become that person if you had lived their life. And you could go, oh, okay, I guess that's true. And now, like everything underneath that, if you can accept that there is a potential for you in the darkness that is in potential in you to have gone down that road, then it's much easier to say, oh, yeah, I'm projecting pride onto people and jealousy and judgment and impatience. So you're very right. Like every little tiny imbalance is getting projected onto others. And this is why the course is so brilliant in the way it teaches this concept, because it says, hey, other people are your best mirrors, the best mirror that's available. The way you feel about people, react to people, respond to people is showing you all the data you need to know what's blocked in you. If someone triggers you even a little bit, you say, oh, thank you so much, my brother or my sister, for showing me that I have some annoyance in myself that I haven't fully met yet. And that concept can seem like far reaching for people or like far away, but this is something that we actually start doing from childhood. And we can see it in these kind of examples of like two people in a fight needing to be right. Okay, this person on this side really wants to be right and have their point acknowledged. You also really want to be right and have your point acknowledged. So you're both attacking each other and arguing like crazy. But if you just look at that dynamic and say, oh, yeah, I'm upset that they're trying to prove their point because I'm trying to prove my point. Oh, there it is. I'm projecting my need to be right onto them. And I'm not accepting of my need to be right. I haven't loved and forgiven my own need to be right. And so I have to despise it in other people. That's it. That's why other people are the road to freedom. The Course says heaven is entered 2 by 2. Right? The only way to get to heaven is through the person right in front of you. If you can see them as the Christ, they become like the open door to heaven.
Okay. Woo! This is so, I'm like high from this conversation because I can feel, having, imperfectly been working through the course and what you're talking about. It's trippy, my friends. Seriously, this works. This works. And the healing that happens in your body, in your mind, in your spirit. This is what we talked about, balancing your lower 3 chakras. It is this work. This is everything. Let's move into, because I know you also have expertise in Jesus' teachings and the Essenes, and I know that's an intense, longer conversation. We're going to do our best to give some time, to really dive into Christ consciousness and what we can share, what you can share from these beautiful teachings that are parallel with, of course, the Course and miracles and what we're talking about today.
Yeah, for sure. This is such an amazingly fun and incredible, awe-inspiring rabbit hole. And so there's kind of 2 ways we can approach this, Julie. We can emphasize the side of the rabbit hole that goes into the proof that Jesus really was an Essene, which is just incredible to me. And endlessly interesting, proof from the Bible and extra biblical sources, and how Jesus became what he was through the Essene path, and how his gospel was distorted by Paul and the Roman Catholic Church into something totally different. And then we can sprinkle in like the actual Essene teachings, or we can do the opposite and we can focus on the Essene teachings and sprinkle in like why we know Jesus was an Essene. So it depends on which one you'd rather emphasize in the conversation.
Okay. I was asking my heart, and I'm laughing because I heard her say both, but I think in lieu of time, this is always my answer, both and.
Yeah, we can sort of do both.
I think the latter, where my gut is to go deep into the Essene teachings and then to sprinkle in, and maybe we'll have you back to do more of the history. But I
Cool.
think the teachings to me, this is funny, I'm hearing, if you're a vegan, this is the meat or the lentils of the protein.
This is the lentils of the conversation.
The lentils, I've never said that.
Neither have I.
Here we go, lentils and all.
Yeah.
Probably 8 lentils. Anyhow, I'll let you dive in. I'm just laughing. Gotta laugh with ourselves.
Okay, so let's just do the basics of how we know Jesus was an Essene. So number one, we have the fact that Jesus was clearly condemning the Pharisees and Sadducees like crazy in the New Testament, which would logically lend you to believe, he probably wasn't a Pharisee or a Sadducee himself. So what was he then? Like, what sect of Judaism was this guy if he wasn't a Pharisee and Sadducee? Because he clearly had a lot of problems with them. And so, like, you have to understand the climate of the first century world and like what it was like to live in those days to really get this. And so basically there was just like 3 Orthodox Jewish sects at the time, which would be Pharisees, Sadducees, and like Hasmoneans, which are kind of a blend of that. That's like the Orthodox class of Judaism in the first century. And then you had this amazing sect of Judaism called the Essenes, Esaloi in Hebrew, which had really separated themselves from the rest of the Orthodox Jews. And that's because they were a very mystical branch of Judaism. They were a Kabbalistic sect of Judaism. And they began through the Babylonian captivity, actually, in like, I want to say 300 BC, when the Babylonians captured the Jews and Israel and all of that. There was like a couple hundred years of captivity, and then the Jews eventually broke off. And during those years of captivity, the religion of Zoroastrianism was prevalent in, I believe, Syria was where that happened at the time. And so they mingled with the Zoroastrian philosophy quite a bit for those few hundred years until the Maccabean revolts around 150 BC. And then the Jews kind of separated themselves. So the Essenes clearly, according to scholars who study this very closely, they share exactly a minimum of 10% identical teachings with Zoroastrianism. So they clearly borrowed some things that they liked, but they were very Kabbalistic branch of Judaism that followed the teachings of the Kabbalah, which is very mystical. And so basically they believed that Enoch, not Abraham, was the true father of Judaism. They actually believed that the Jewish religion began deviating from God's laws when Abraham began. Because the story of Abraham is where he thinks God tells him, the Bible says God tells him, but he believed God told him to kill and murder his firstborn son to prove his loyalty to God, which is a very satanic thing to do. This is what Satanism and Luciferianism does to their initiates, is like kill something you love or sacrifice something you love or kill something innocent to prove your loyalty to us. And you don't get to ascend up the ranks until you've done these things. So it's a very, very satanic, demonic thing to ask someone to murder their son. But the Jews believed it was God. And so Abraham was like, okay, I'll do that for you. And of course, he wrestled with it. But as he has the knife being held up, if the story is literally true, then a probably, fifth density extraterrestrial being of light shows up and is like, wait, don't kill your son. And it stays his hand. And he says, God doesn't want you to do this. And then he finds a ram stuck in a thicket and he kills the ram instead. So that's kind of where the inception of the pagan satanic practice of blood sacrifice weaved its way into Judaism, and then they were off to the races. And from there on out, it was like part of their law and their canon to murder innocent animals and shed blood to get forgiveness. And it even says in the Old Testament, there is no forgiveness of sins without the shedding of blood, which is literally a satanic doctrine. So you can see the Essenes, who were very tapped into oneness and mysticism, were like, oh my goodness, these Jewish people have wandered and deviated so far from the holy law, the law of one, that we cannot take any part with them. And so they literally separated themselves to this burning wasteland in the desert of Qumran to create their own sect. And so they were really trying to get back to natural law because they saw how far Judaism had strayed from it. And, they're captive to the Egyptians, to the Babylonians, now to the Romans. They've just gone from one captor to another. And the Essenes were like, hey, it's because you guys were killing animals for forgiveness. Just shouting this at the Jews. Like, the fact that you guys are always captive is because you're doing this animal sacrifice thing that God doesn't want. So if you read the Old Testament, all the prophets from Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Malachi, they all start condemning animal sacrifices in the Old Testament, saying, God does not desire sacrifices. Turn away from me the smell of your burned animals. I want nothing to do with it. Over and over again in the Old Testament, they're saying this is not what God wants. And yet in the first century, they're still doing it. And Jesus shows up on the scene being like, you guys, isn't it written in your law, I do not desire sacrifice? This is not who God is. But when you study the first century history of the Jesus movement, it's very clear that Paul, who was a Pharisee Jew, had his conversion, became a Christian, and started preaching this very different gospel that not only are blood sacrifices okay with God, Jesus himself was the last blood sacrifice. And so then there's this huge rift between Paul and the disciples of Jesus after his crucifixion. And the disciples are like, hey, man, we keep hearing your teaching that our master was the blood sacrifice of God. But no, he came to take away animal sacrifices. And so that's where we see the Essenian philosophy of Jesus really start showing up in the Bible. Once you understand who the Essenes were, there was a northern branch called the Nazarenes and a southern branch called the Oseans. And Jesus was born in the town of Qumran called Nazareth, and he was called Jesus the Nazarene, right? Nazarene is like an etymological combination of Nazar, Essene, Nazarene. It's an abbreviated way of saying it. So it's to delineate which branch of Essenes he was from. And you have these early first century historians like Josephus and Philo and Pliny and Eusebius who talk at length about the amazing Nazarene Essenes and their healing powers. They were called the therapeutae in their day, which is a Greek word that means like healers. And all of a sudden, it makes perfect sense out of Jesus, right? You're like, oh, he was a healer. He performed signs and wonders and miracles. All these practices from the Kabbalah, Jesus is seen practicing them. And then Philo and Josephus describe the creeds that the Essenes lived by. And there are 7 exact word-for-word creeds from the Essenes, such as do not swear any oaths to anyone or anything, not even to God. And you see these different creeds that the Essenes believed that Jesus teaches in the Beatitudes in the book of Matthew and Luke, 7 of them word for word. And then the fact that he was called the Nazarene, we know that was the Nazar Essene sect. So like we've got all the proof we need right there in the Bible alone that he was an Essene, right? Not a Orthodox Jew. So the Essenes had this philosophy that God is law. God is law. And when they discovered, by the way, the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1948 or 1952, they found all these different scrolls that took them quite a while to decipher. And they found fragments of a Essene Gospel of John, which is older than the oldest copy of the Gospel of John we have in the Bible today. And in the Bible today, most of us know the opening of the Gospel of John, chapter 1. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Well, in the Essene Gospel of John, it says, in the beginning was the law, and the law was with God, and the law was God. And then it says, and the law became flesh and dwelt among us, Jesus. So Jesus was the Essenes' Messiah. They were a very messianic sect of Judaism, because they believed that if they continued to live in this very physically disciplined way, they were strict vegetarians, they fasted every day, they were all about physical health and perfecting the physical body, because they knew that the physical body is like the platform, the foundation from which we can ascend spiritually. And that sickness and disease, impurities in the body represent demonic negative energy that needs to be purged, right? So they believe that if we live according to natural law, which they would call the laws of the earthly mother will heal the human body and upgrade it, and we will extend the human lifespan back to its original intention. And from there, we can ascend our consciousness to the Heavenly Father. So the earthly mother was their foundation. The Heavenly Father was the ceiling they were shooting for. And by the 1st century AD, they were absolutely succeeding in this theory, because Josephus writes that the average age for an Essene in the 1st century was 120. And that's the average age, not like the highest age. That's the average age an Essene was living to. So you for sure had some Essenes living to be 180 and maybe even 200, right? And the average age of their day for in Jerusalem would be about 60 to 70 years. So they had doubled the average lifespan in their own community by living according to natural law. And they believed that enough successive generations of this, eventually there will be an avatar, a Messiah, born among us, who will be the full demonstration of the law in human form. He will be righteous from birth, right? And when Jesus shows up, John the Baptist is like, he's the guy. He's the Messiah we've been prophesying. He is the chosen one that God has sent us to restore the law to Judaism. So they very much saw Jesus as the reformer of Judaism, not the destroyer of Judaism, the reformer of it, trying to take it back to its original intention. So this is why Jesus said, I have not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law. They said, well, what is the fulfillment of the law? And he said, love God, love your neighbor. That's it. You guys wandered away from the truth. And in the Essene gospel, Julie, Jesus says, the farther away from God a law is, the more laws there are. The closer a law is to God, the fewer there are. And that's why the ultimate law is the law of one, right? One law that summarizes all the others. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is how we demonstrate that love, which is by loving our neighbor as if they are God. If you do that, you fulfill all the law and the prophets. But see, the Israelites, the Jews, had wandered so far from the holy law that they needed, I think by the time Jesus was around in the 1st century, there was 180 Jewish laws in the Old Testament that they had to follow strictly every day. And that's because the lower man's consciousness is, the lower their spiritual intelligence is, the more rules they need, to stay in line and stuff. But the higher our consciousness rises, the fewer laws we need, because we become the embodiment of the law. So Jesus was the Messiah to the Essenes, not because he was the blood sacrifice of God. They were very, very against animal sacrifices. And many of the texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls are all about their viewpoint of how demonic and satanic that practice was. And you see Jesus actually in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He goes into the temple and it says he releases all the animals, the ox, the sheep, the goats, and the doves from their cages. And he doesn't permit anyone to carry a vessel of blood through the temple. And he shakes his finger at the Pharisees and says, you've turned my father's house into a den of thieves. So if he's letting all the animals loose, he clearly doesn't believe that these animals can forgive sins if they're killed, right? He went around saying, hey, just so you know, your sins are forgiven. He was announcing to people that their sins were forgiven because righteousness is about repentance, forgiveness, right? And Jesus called his gospel, if you remember, the gospel of repentance for the remission of sins, not the gospel of confession or the gospel of blood sacrifice. The gospel of repentance, which is repent means to rethink or to turn around and go the other way. It's that righteousness has to be embodied in you or it means nothing. And again, that was kind of the big rift between Paul and James, the brother of Jesus, and the disciples. They were preaching faith without works is dead. You can't call Jesus your Lord and Savior, and you're not feeding the poor and helping the needy and visiting the prisoners. Like, this was our master's gospel, is that love and righteousness only exist if they're demonstrated. And Paul said, no, 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 faith alone. Just confess Jesus. That's all you have to do. Boom, you're saved. You're going to go to heaven. And James said, no, 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 faith without works is dead. And Jesus said, don't come to me and call me Lord, Lord, when you haven't helped the least of these. So, like, those are opposite gospels. I don't care what your argument is, or if you grew up in Christianity, you cannot deny that those are two opposite messages. And again, the roots of that gospel of righteousness and repentance comes from the Essenes. That is the Essenes philosophy. That if you read the Essene Gospel of Peace, for example, and we can get more into the teachings if you want, but you'll see that theme all over the book. It's the law, the law, the law. We must live in alignment with the law of God, and by no other way are we saved from our sins.
Woo! A little light conversation. I'm just taking it in, and it's so powerful. It's like, what I'm getting. I want to make a connection for a minute. Two connections. One, going back to understanding even the Orthodox Jewish people in that time must have been in such fear to think that, I know the high priests with the animal sacrifices, to think that God would be such that would,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we have to, it's like, I think about, my God, the fear and the lack of consciousness. I mean, it must have been at a root level, like complete. I mean, and there's insanity and
Yes,
obviously a lack of an ignorance. I'm
absolutely.
thinking diagram. The little bit I've studied of Kabbalistic tradition and the tree of life, it's actually interesting. I was picturing, I'm not an expert by any means. I've studied it a little bit, and it reminded me of your picture of the chakras, the tree of life. There's a similar, there's a real similar connection. Actually, I think that goes into that with root. Gosh, I wish I can remember more, but the idea, the enlightenment is at the top of the crown, and I forget the word, but it is
the chakras, the tree of life. It's just its own kind of unique depiction of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And even in that time and space, gosh, I'm just thinking, it's like we can't accept how simple it is, right? Love your neighbor as yourself, which, by the way, it also means to love yourself and to love your neighbor.
Yeah. Yep.
That's an important piece. I know Louise Hay got a lot into that, right? The power of loving yourself and love your neighbor as yourself. So you got both. It's like, it's brilliant what you said. I've heard that, and I forgot the idea that the farther away we get from God's laws, the more laws that are needed. And I think it was like 613 laws, if I remember, like a lot of laws.
Yeah.
And it's just, then it comes back to the law of one, which is where we started. I am curious, just for a minute, I do want to talk about the gospel of peace, but can you share for people your understanding of how A Course in Miracles, which is a channeled work, because to me that feels like completely Jesus's teachings, how that's connected to the teachings of him and the Essene, coming from the Essene people?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's totally aligned in every way. Jesus was clearly teaching to love people and to walk the path of forgiveness. Jesus says, forgive your enemies 70 times 7, as often as you need to, always forgive. If they strike you, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, give them your cloak. He really strongly emphasized this practice, that you cannot say you love God and hate your neighbor. It's a total contradiction. The law is one. There's only one God, one being, one reality. It's everywhere. It's everything. And if you don't see it everywhere, you don't see it at all. So you've got to start with seeing it in your neighbor. So Jesus was able to take this law all the way to his bloody, torturous death and be on the cross and forgive his murderers while they're murdering him. Right? While they're nailing him to the cross, he's saying, forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. So he, again, clearly was the embodiment of that law. So A Course in Miracles is just like the deep PhD level dissertation of what he was teaching. And who knows, like maybe this is the kind of stuff he was spitting to his disciples and behind closed doors, maybe these were his real teachings, but we only have a tiny, tiny fragment of them in the New Testament and a few others in extra biblical sources. But yeah, I mean, the tree of life thing is cool because the Essenes' main philosophy came from the tree of life. They call it the tree of life. And in the Essene gospel, Jesus says, at the center of the infinite garden stands the tree of life. And the infinite garden was their term for the universe. And you can ask yourself, what's the center of the universe? And clearly there's no physical geographical location that is. They're talking about in you is the center of the universe. So we ourselves are meant to embody the tree of life. And that tree of life to the Essenes was the 7 roots of the earthly mother and the 7 branches of the heavenly father. And each root or branch stands for one of those angels. An angel, the word malakim in Hebrew means angel or messenger. It's just the metaphorical term they use for like the powers, the forces of the divine, the archetypes of God that we have lost communion with. This is why man has fallen so far, because through our unforgiveness, through our hating and resenting each other and killing each other, we've severed connection to those angels. So the Essene main practice was communing with the angels because, for example, like the angel of love, one of the angels of the Heavenly Father, it's the angel of love that gives you the ability to forgive and put to practice all the things the Course teaches. You need relationship with the angel of love, which is really like love itself, the power of love, you know. And so they communed with the angels so that they would have the ability to live and practice these teachings from like A Course in Miracles, because the ego can't do it. The fallen nature can't do it. Only the divine nature in us can do it. And we have to reestablish connection to our divine nature first.
Beautifully, beautifully, powerfully said, Aaron. And I think this just I keep seeing this like golden thread circling back. Everything we're talking about. I even think about, the idea of your true nature, your youest you. It is your divine connection. So, and I don't want to get the quote wrong, but from my understanding with Jesus's teachings is that he was saying, you can do these things even better, even more. Like, don't see yourself in me. Get that you are just as much of the divine, of the heavenly Mother, Father, Great Spirit as he was. And so going back to what we've been saying, to me at a very existential level, it's a cry. When we see hurting people hurt others, it's a cry to reignite and remember who you really are, your divinity, I don't even have the words. It's just so powerful that we're saying what you're saying. And it's like so simple and not easy for many people.
Yeah.
It's possible.
Yeah. Simple in theory, more difficult in practice. But when you practice it, like you've got to overcome the fallen nature, the sin nature, which is ego.
Exactly.
You've got to overcome that nature, which is in great resistance to forgiving others because it wants to be right. It wants to have its positions and all that. But once you begin to transcend that egoic nature more and more, forgiveness becomes not only a not difficult practice, it becomes a joy. It becomes a practice that you actually seek out actively. You're looking for what needs forgiveness in my life, in my world. Like, what am I still judging? Because you've now gained the experience that every time I forgive, my frequency rises. I live with a little bit more joy, a little bit more peace, a little bit more love in my heart. And man, it feels good. And so at a certain point, that takes over. And it's like, once the lower chakras are not anchoring you down so much, the higher chakras begin pulling you up.
With the lower, I feel like I'm coming back to these lower 3 because I can imagine anyone listening who's like, okay, I want to balance my lower 3 and then activate, our hyperachiever types here.
I want to do it all.
I want to do it all. And I think, forgiveness is key. The other side of it too, and you mentioned this earlier, the extraordinary power, healing power of unconditional love. And I would love to ask you, I've heard of this great acronym. I think of this all the time with ego, edging God out, edging great out. It helps me. So I'll share, this is kind of funny. I don't know if I've ever shared this here. I get a lot of signs in my life and on the road. Like I literally feel like is like, hey, Julie, if I'm like, I need an answer. And it's like, check out the license plate, check out the truck. So there are trucks near me, maybe near you, that's literally in huge blue, say ego. Okay. Huge.
Whoa.
Yeah. I don't know if it's just me where I'm living. And granted, you start working the Course in Miracles. Let me tell you something. Everything is going to show the F up. Everything got to be healed. So amen to that. When I'm working on it, And I can tell like my ego, maybe there's something, and usually my husband who has minimal ego, he's very quick to be like, yeah, I'm not right. You're right. Which is annoying because there's no strife. But there was a situation, I think it was not with him, with someone else. And I saw the big ego truck go by. I was like, okay, that's a sign. Julie,
Yep.
where are you edging greatness out? So 2 days ago, I have been really feeling like and I want to say, because I try to put this into practice daily, forgiveness of myself, of others, understanding, knowing we're not perfect. And the first time I've ever seen this, I saw an ego truck parked, and the first part of the E to the G was like, it was like watermarked out. It wasn't there. And I just heard, you're slowly, your ego is taking a back seat. She's not as I could feel the
Nice.
shift in myself, and I'm like,
Yeah.
look at the truck. I should have taken a picture, but I was driving. So anyhow, I have to just say with the ego,
That's pretty amazing.
it was so cool. And I felt it. I was like, oh, that's shifting. I can see it. Look at the freaking truck. Never seen that. So,
Yeah.
sin, ego, I think they're the same. And to get
All
this,
synonyms. Yep.
yeah, and we're human. So we have it. We have this ego, I think, to talk about for a minute. We're not bad. It's not,
Mhm.
shaming, and that's not going to do anything. What I've learned, it's the power of unconditional love. Let's talk about that for a minute, and how that relates to what Jesus taught as well.
Well, this is a big part of what I teach. Like in 4D University, it's all about the reason I created 4D University is because I am passionate about teaching people how to get into the fourth density, the heart chakra level, the fourth chakra level. That's 4D. That's the next progression of human consciousness above the solar plexus, which is the ego chakra of ego consciousness and self consciousness. Humanity has been in third density for 75,000 some odd years. And now we are finally moving into the beginnings of the next density level, which is again fourth density. And Ra calls that the density of love and understanding. And I like that they use that term love and understanding because we talked about that earlier, right? It's the density where now consciousness. So consciousness and light or the photon are synonyms. Consciousness is the non-physical version. Light or the photon is the physical version of consciousness. So the faster the photon vibrates, like on the quantum level, the more ability consciousness has to express itself. So every density is a different rate of vibration. So first density, much slower vibration. Consciousness can only express itself in that density as earth, water, fire, air. The four elements. That's first density, the mineral kingdom, and the four elements. Second density is like insect and animal kingdom, everything in that spectrum. That's when consciousness is vibrating fast enough to be an individual in an environment and have a sense of self. Not self-awareness yet, but you are a self living in an environment, interacting with the environment. That's second density. Third density is once an organism does that reflexive mechanism where it becomes self-aware and goes, I exist. And it has a mental idea of itself created. Now I can think about past and future. I can fear the past and the future. So all these new variables come streaming into consciousness at the third density level of vibration. And that's where humanity's been for quite a long time. And so at that density level where the ego is fully formed, we believe we're separate from each other. You might be a threat to me, in opposition to me, you're competition for me. And it's this like survival of the fittest world. And so consciousness has to go through that, right? Like you said, ego's not bad or wrong in any way. It's a divine design meant to be the catalyst for consciousness to keep progressing, because only the ego could force divine beings like ourselves to fight each other and to, have opposition to one another. Because without that, there's just the awareness of oneness, and consciousness couldn't keep progressing. So ego is this driving force for evolution that forces humans or consciousness to evolve very quickly, because there's a whole lot of suffering in the third density, And the other big thing is that in third density, once we're in ego consciousness, the law of one says now you have to also choose your polarity, positive or negative. And you don't get out of third density or graduate to fourth until you make your choice. So that's why getting into the heart and choosing unconditional love is the greatest decision you can ever make, to say, I commit to the path of light. I commit my heart and soul. I swear my soul to the path of love, to become love and to live from my heart. And when you start getting into the heart chakra and living from there, I call that heart-based consciousness or fourth density consciousness. That is the graduation point for this realm. It's like, if you don't want to keep reincarnating back here again, get into your heart and learn to live there. And by no other way can we stay in the heart than with forgiveness. Because the moment we get into judgment, we drop down into those lower three centers again. And that's where our consciousness is coming from. So we've got to pull the consciousness back up to the heart by forgiving again and again. And that teaches us what unconditional love really is. It gives us the perspective of God, of God's perspective of reality and of everybody, is that God's not holding anyone's trespasses against them, as the Bible says, so neither should I. And that's how consciousness progresses to that fourth density level, where now it's vibrating fast enough that I can perceive, hey, yeah, maybe you're in that body, I'm in this body, but we're not separate. We're one. You and I are made of the same substance. We come from the same source. We have all the same needs and desires. We depend on one another. Like, I need to farm while you do the medicine. And, we are one. We cannot survive without each other. That's a fourth density level of awareness. And we really see that in our world right now, don't we? That humanity is really struggling to integrate that awareness. It's like, we kind of know we're all dependent on each other and one with each other, and that fighting and killing is bad. But yet every couple of years, we still justify a new war, and we still justify corruption everywhere and political tyranny. And we allow these things because we're still, a big segment of humanity is still stuck in that third density level of consciousness.
So I want to come back to the question of where Jesus was, what dimension. I'm going to put that on the table. But what you just said, it's really powerful, Aaron. And so let's say, and I've felt this, right? Let's say we're seeing what's happening in the election, right? There's a lot of attacking. And what I believe A Course in Miracles would say is that is a mirror of our collective consciousness. So going back to what we talked about, if we are looking at the collective healing of the first three chakras and balancing them, we would want to get curious and develop an understanding first, right? Before for forgiveness of the parties, of people that feel really entitled to being right. Like, really, it is, if you're saying yes to, I love this, swearing to your oath is to be unconditional love, to be this light. And this is part of why I think this conversation is crucial right now. That anyone that's with us on that, then first what we got to do is really have an understanding. Doesn't mean you condone it, doesn't mean you forgive it or pardon it or agree, but to understand and then come from that place of forgiveness and removing judgment so we can become less polarized. I will say the difference, well, I'll ask you, because if you become less polarized, the Law of One talks about this. I believe, I remember, when you're less polarized, talk about that. When you're less polarized, what does that look like?
So there's two different contexts we're using that word in, or I've used that word in.
Yep.
When I say, like, in our country, we're very polarized, I'm using it in like the political, social climate sense of we have very disagreeing positions, right? But the nature of polarity is really just the balanced interchange of opposites, where the farther away I move from that which is negative, the more positively polarized I become. Flip it around. The farther away I move from that which is positive, the more negatively polarized I become. So the goal of the spiritual path is to become as polarized as possible, to choose a polarity and go down that polarity all the way. It's as if, God, the Logos, the universal mind is watching Earth and the planet and every soul in it. And the graduation point is to pick a polarity. And until a soul chooses a polarity, they literally can't continue their evolutionary path. They have to choose. So the Creator is just watching every soul and waiting for that choice point to be made, where Ra says on the positive, it's when you become 51% or greater service to others oriented. And then 95% or greater service to self oriented. And we don't have to talk about the reason why those two numbers here, because that's a whole nother conversation, but that's kind of the graduation point. And as soon as you choose one or the other, then the source says, all right, great. They've gotten what they needed to get out of that density. Now it's time for them to go to the next density. So it's all about being polarized in this density. But the way that we become positively polarized is by not resisting or separating our heart from anything. Separation is the negative polarity. Oneness and love and unity is the positive polarity. So for that reason, we want to be as unpolarized as possible when it comes to opinions, judgments, ideologies in the world. Like, we don't want to hold on to all these positions, because then we're becoming separated from others, right? In order to truly love everyone, we have to understand everyone's perspective. And so going back to what I mentioned earlier about our political climate in our country, it's like no one is making the remotest, even faintest attempt to understand the other side, right? The left doesn't make the slightest attempt to try to understand people on the right, and the right doesn't make the slightest attempt to understand people on the left. They only demonize each other, and they say, well, you're just a bunch of fascist, Nazi baby killers or whatever. And it's like, okay, do they think they're that? Well, no, they think they're right. Yes. So what's the point of calling them all those names? There's no communication happening. So there's no unity that can happen. So that's what being polarized means in a worldly sense. We want to be polarized in a spiritual sense, which means we have to love everything and have a space for everything to live in our heart.
And that is the PhD level that I believe. I mean, to be born and here right now. I'm just saying, you, me, anyone tuning in that's still here. If you're still here, you're watching and you're with us. You're here. I'm going to start. You're in the 51%. You are here to be a light bearer in this.
No doubt.
Standing the 4D. There's no question for me. And I think you're right. What we're seeing is, we're seeing this come up. Like, I think of a pimple, like the yucky stuff comes up and you have to look at it until it like heals. It feels like our country is going through a massive acne
big time
explosion. I mean, that's a weird metaphor, but it's like,
no, that's the perfect metaphor, because actually it's a detox, right? Whenever the body has any symptom of sickness, it's a detox process happening, whether it's a rash on your skin, profuse sweating, acne, vomiting, diarrhea. These are all different ways the body expels toxins out of the body. And so the earth is a macrocosm of the human body. It's just like the human body in the way it functions, in that all the negative energy humanity puts into the earth through our negative thinking and behaving and war and all that stuff, that negative energy has to come out again at some point. And one of the ways it comes out of the earth to be expelled is like natural disasters, tornadoes, earthquakes, devastating nature events are a creation of mankind from all the toxicity we've put into the earth, both physically and spiritually. But that it happens on a collective level as well. Like, the collective consciousness of humanity is like a person, an individual person that's doing shadow work, right? Just like you and I got to face our shadows, feel them, heal them, forgive them. Humanity as a whole has to do that as well. And these dark energies have to keep coming up until we're willing to take responsibility for them and say, hey, wait a minute, we are no longer okay with child trafficking. It is done. We are healing this. And we collectively say no to that, right? And it keeps coming up, and it's like a small percentage of the human population sees it, calls it out, but not enough. And it goes back down again. Years later, it resurfaces, and it's just like this tidal wave of shadow work. Every few decades or generations, the same energies keep coming up, giving humanity a chance to say, no, we're done with war. We will not tolerate war on this planet any longer. We're going to heal that energy and forgive that energy. So that's why we're seeing what we see in the world, because it's time for corruption to come up to be healed. It's time for war. It's time for child trafficking. It's time for political tyranny, medical tyranny. So much corruption and darkness is coming up because we're going into that fourth density. And just like in our chakras, you got to heal those lower three energies before you can really get into the fourth energy center. The same is true for humanity, right?
So powerful. And I'm just saying, because I can feel the energy of our community and people listening, and you can do something. Because I think sometimes the feeling or thought is, what the hell? Like, what can one person do? Let's be reminded that one person tapped in, tuned in to spirit, to love, to unconditional love is more powerful by hundreds of thousands
A
than
powerhouse.
powerhouse. So this, I just keep getting this. This is the work. We're seeing it. And what can you do? You go first to yourself. There's one of the lessons I want to say early on, maybe you can speak to this. I have like 60 lessons in my phone. They go off, all the different ones that I want to be reminded of. And one is,
Nice.
I am not upset for the reason I think I am.
Yeah.
I am not upset, which of course then can be like upsetting. Like, I think I'm upset. What? So maybe just to talk for a minute about this whole, I'm not upset for the reason I think, and there's always an attachment to the past. We're not really in the present. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. The Course says, I'm never upset for the reason I think, and I do not perceive my own best interests. Those are two really good pills to swallow.
Yeah.
Like tough pills to swallow, but really healthy pills to swallow, because they will really start to illuminate your ignorance to you. When you always like repeat those mantras to yourself, anytime you're upset, never upset for the reason I think. I'm never upset for the reason I think. You can just like go to that mantra when you're angry. And I promise you, man, I've done this dozens of times. Like it will depolarize that anger, and it will start opening your awareness to what the real cause of your anger is. And you'll start to find that core of resistance in yourself of, oh, I thought I was upset because they didn't do or say that thing I wanted. Now I see I have an attachment to the behavior of other people. I have an attachment to being right or whatever. And that's the real reason I'm upset. Ego will not allow you to see those things in real time. Ego is the great reality editor, It's always editing reality in real time, and it's projecting its deep, dark wishes onto people and outside of itself. And so you think that the outside world is the reason why you're upset. But of course, the outside world cannot be the cause of an inside problem. It has to be an inside problem if the anger is inside. Like you can be angry in the same room as me and I'm at peace. So it's not my anger. Exactly. It's your anger, right? So it's in you. So what's the cause of my anger? It's always an imbalance in my belief system. It's always an attachment. It's the outcome-based happiness, right? So then I can use that mantra to lead me back to the actual problem that's really taking place, which if it's anger, for example, is some kind of attachment I'm holding on to that needs to be surrendered and released. And then likewise with I do not perceive my own best interests. All these mantras are given to the ego. They're for the ego. The true self doesn't need to remind itself of these things. It already knows them. But the ego needs to be reminded, wait a minute, I'm never upset for the reason I think. Wait a minute, I don't actually perceive my own best interests. Meaning I think I want this thing. I want this outcome. But if I chase it and chase it and chase it and get it, a lot of times it ends up being a really bad thing for me. So like I can't actually know what an outcome will produce in the end. I can never actually know what's in my best interest. Only God knows. And so instead of trying to control outcomes, I'm just going to surrender every outcome to God. Because, hey, if you've lived more than a couple years, you probably have the evidence to know that some of the worst things that happen to me end up being for my absolute best. And they teach me the most things. They grow and expand me the most. So bad things actually can be very good. And the things I wanted the most in life ended up being some of the worst things that happened to me. So what appears to be good can really become bad. So like when we live in duality like that, chasing good, running from bad, we don't perceive our own best interests. We don't really know what something's going to lead us to. So it's better to live from trust and surrender, where you just accept everything as equally good and say, it's all for my benefit. It's whatever God wants, and whatever God wants is good. And I trust that, and that's enough. And that is the Course's teaching on I need do nothing. You know that one?
Oh, yeah. Which
for so good
is like, what the F? What do you? And I think for those of us that are hyper doers and achievers, this is, look, I just think it's brilliant. It's beyond brilliant. It transcends IQ brilliance. It's just what you said, and I'm picturing the energy it's a neutralizer. It neutralizes the negative polarity of the ego.
Big time.
Yeah, I can feel it. And you actually said it. This is something it's become a practice. And I think for many of us, this can be a hard pill to swallow, is to say, I try to start my day, Erin, with, divine loving creator. And I have different words every day, but God, please let me, actually this morning, I was like, let me turn over my small self, like the little s, to our great self. Let me just show up and try to be quiet and hear what is your will, and to do that. And that is part of a practice, I believe, as well, with forgiveness, with shifting. And that for some people can feel scary. It's funny. I've done a lot of looking back and when did I take my will, and when was I kind of in the flow of God's will? And when I look at it, I'm like, I do not want to do my will with a smaller case s. Hell no. Like, it is a different outcome. And I'm going to tell you, way better, beyond better. I mean, following this intuition, my intuition led me to this podcast, to you, to this work. I mean, so there's a trust, there's a surrender. I love these other kind of, I keep thinking of nutrients. They're almost these characteristics, these ways of they're nutrients. They feel like they help us to grow, we build our faith muscle. And I just, I love what you said. Yeah.
Aho to that.
Aho to that. Okay. Before we wrap, this is always the hardest part for me with you, because I'm like, I don't want to ever wrap this conversation.
Can we just not wrap?
We keep just doing another one. I'm like, come back again.
Let's just keep unwrapping.
Yeah. Just keep on unwrapping, because isn't that the divine, constantly evolving?
For sure.
So we're just emulating the divine. Thank you much. I did want to ask, I don't know if it's a technical question. So maybe just briefly talking about, I know I've gotten questions around the fifth dimension, the sixth dimension, and I know the law of one gets into this. And where does, if we were to interview Jesus and say, hey, what dimension, where are you coming from? I would imagine, of course, 4D. I've heard some say 6D. I'm just curious your take on the next dimensions, and where would Jesus and his teachings follow?
Yeah, well, the law of one actually gives this answer, because they do ask Ra about this question. And it's interesting because Ra says that Jesus was a late fourth density wanderer. A wanderer is a higher density soul that's already graduated from third density. So it could be fourth through seventh. And they choose to incarnate into a third density body, into a third density planet, which has the veil of forgetting, right? So they choose to forget who they really are, where they really come from, to go back to a third density planet to be of service. And of course, because third density has by far the most polarity in it of any density. It's the most polarized and charged density, with equal parts dark and light, that it's a really good playing ground for higher density souls to play out some of the most challenging and advanced lessons. Because, like the mystics of old, the sages of the Middle Ages who were getting burned alive and guillotined and crucified for their beliefs, like that doesn't happen at any other density than third. So if you want to, if your soul wants to say like, hey, am I up for being a spiritual martyr in the dark ages and sticking to my truth, even to the point of death? Let's go find out. Let's go back to third density. Can't do that in sixth density. So like higher density souls come here, and that's what Jesus was doing, was to be of service to this planet. Because what's really cool is Ra says Jesus had actually just become eligible for fifth density graduation. He had completed his full fourth density cycle, which means, interestingly enough, that he wasn't a native Earth soul, because Earth was in the third density at that point. Now, I don't know exactly how it works. Maybe he spent his third density here, but I really don't think that's the way it works. I think I've heard a channeler say Jesus' soul was from the Pleiades. So he's a Pleiadian soul. So if that's true, he had his third density experience on one of those planets and evolved all the way through fourth density. And then before he went to fifth density, he saw the plight of planet Earth. and saw that the people, especially in the Middle East in that time, were just like locked into this monolithic religion, animal sacrificing, just like a perpetual spiritual childhood that they couldn't get out of. And he said, I want to go help those people. And I want to go see if I can be a martyr for the truth and for love. And so he chose to, rather than going to a fifth density lifetime, he said, let me go wander back into third density and be the Messiah for these people, type of thing. So it's a really interesting way to see the soul of Jesus. And it kind of makes sense, right? Like Jesus brought a very different energy than not only just any person of that time, but like even any other sage of our planet's history, like Buddha, Krishna, Lao Tzu, all these say, like Jesus is so unique from all these other sages in his message of loving one another is the path to heaven, forgiveness, going to the cross to teach forgiveness and to show forgiveness. A very unique sage, Jesus was. And it makes sense that he was coming with this kind of different frequency from the Pleiades. So now I can't know if all that's true for fact, but it sure resonates as being true.
Yeah. No, and appreciate the greater kind of perspective. I was reading, I think it's one of Wayne Dyer, who I just loved, his book on the Tao Te Ching. And he was connecting so much, just because you mentioned Lao Tzu, just so much wisdom, which to me, and I'm curious what you think, well, first of all, with our different sages, including obviously Jesus, I always get this feeling of it's like a higher evolved being. I think actually Neil Donald Walsh gets into this too in Conversations with God. Highly evolved beings that choose to come and be in the thick of it. And
yeah,
I think this is a bit of an assertion, but I'm curious. This is one of my last questions. And I remember Ra going into this about wanderers. I would imagine any of us that are feeling like, I know for me, the desire to beam light and to shift consciousness and be in the space of unconditional love, which is not always easy. It's like, I can't not do it. It is literally, I can't not be this.
yeah.
And I don't have any other words around it. Like, it is not a vacation to not think about, like, I have to be moving in this direction. And I know with you,
Oh, yes.
anybody tuning in, I would imagine, especially if you're still here, you are. Would you assert there's a not good or bad, right? Not like if you're from, a wanderer, there's no judgment about where
Right.
you consciously, but I would imagine there's some sort of coming in from a different dimension or wanderer kind of aspect. Do you have any thoughts on those of us that just feel like this, we've got to do this. This is so important. This is needed.
Oh, yes. I mean, Ra talks about the graduation to fourth density, the harvest is the term they use, that at the time of harvest on every third density planet, it's a very precarious time because you have this. So for Earth, for third density planets, there is 3 opportunities to graduate. They call it the major cycle, or it's the precession of the equinox. So every 25-ish thousand years, Earth makes that precession. And like the ticking of a clock, the logos of our star system sees if Earth has become 51% or more service to others oriented. And if in that 25,000 years, when we pass that point, we've become 51% or more, we go to a fourth density planet, right? The planet literally becomes magnetized to the higher density or frequency. So like, it doesn't matter if the planet becomes 51% at some time in that cycle, but then falls back into the 30 percentile, it's got to go around again. So you've got to be at 51% or more at the point of harvest, right? And we know that, during times on Earth like Lemuria and Atlantis, the lifespan was, 500, 700 plus years, Ra says, on the planet, because the energy had not been distorted so much yet. And so we were definitely above 51% for probably 10,000 some odd years during those 2 societies. But there was the great cataclysm that happened 12,000 some odd years ago, the Younger Dryas extinction event, where supposedly a huge percentage of the planet got wiped out. Atlantis sunk into the ocean, and civilization started over again. And now with this new planet of the ice age, the planet's covered in ice, and there's been all this death and destruction. A great level of fear entered human consciousness, and they were like, oh no, we have to survive in this cold, cruel world. So tribes began to form, and humans separated off and became separated in their minds. And then the frequency of the planet dropped very significantly. So Ra says, when he was asked, what was the average lifespan at the end of the last major cycle? And Ra said around 700 years. So in the last 25,000 years, so much distortion has happened on this planet that it dropped the human lifespan from around 700 to 60. There's a tremendous dropping of lifespan because the energy dropped so much. And so again, going back to the Essenes, they believed that this is what had happened, is like our ancestors, Enoch and Methuselah, were written in the Bible to have lived to be 900 years old, in the ancient times. So why do people now only live to be 60, 70? It's because we've deviated from the law. So let's separate ourselves from this corrupt society, practicing demon worship and blood sacrifice without knowing it. Let's make our own community in Qumran by the Dead Sea, and we will do it ourselves. And it's like, isn't that what we all need to do right now to build the new earth? Like, separate from the matrix, make our own societies and communities, and begin living differently, begin following natural law. So the Essenes did that because they knew there are higher density beings, there are avatars waiting in the heavens to incarnate here. But one of the rules of incarnation is that your consciousness will always be limited to the level of the body you incarnate into. And so looking at how incredibly distorted the human body had become, only living a measly 60 to 70 years versus 700 to 900 years, we have a lot of healing to do before we're worthy of those higher density beings. So you can almost picture like a lot of these avatars that are thinking about maybe incarnating onto our planet are like, hey guys, y'all are so freaking distorted. Like, we don't really want to incarnate into a body that's that low frequency because we can't really be of much help. So give us a better human body to incarnate into, and then we can start coming among you. So that was the Essenes' philosophy, as if we can heal the human genome, heal the human body by extending the lifespan, and the lifespan is the proof it's working, and there's no other metric that can prove it, then once we start extending the human lifespan, the human body becomes eligible for higher frequency souls. Because look, a soul risks a lot coming to third density. Like, you can easily get swept up into the karma here and then have to repeat the whole third density cycle over again. So like, these masters, these ascended masters, are like not going to risk coming here to help if it's too much of a risk than a reward, They don't want to lose polarity. They want to be of service. So it's like, hey, you guys help us out a little bit by just beginning to return to natural law to a certain degree, and then we can come among you. And the Essenes had done that by the 1st century, having the average lifespan be 120 years. They got their avatar, which was Jesus. It actually worked, and a super, super high frequency soul came among them, and look at what he accomplished in just a short 33 years. Like, he was on another level of frequency, and the Essenes had earned the right for Jesus to be born among them, which I think is amazing.
So beautiful. Oh gosh, I'm like, all right, one more question, and then I'm gonna. It's just so hard with you. I'm like, I'm so many.
It's hard to end on that, right?
It's so hard. Well, I am getting the question, and sometimes I hear them. I don't know who's asking this, but where are the Essenes now? Would that be the Kabbalists? Would that be some of us? Would that be like where did the Essenes disseminate to?
Yeah. Well, it's a bit of a sad story, actually, because the planet was just not ready for their frequency yet and would not tolerate them. They were called the Gnostics as well, because they taught this secret practice that they would not teach anybody unless you became an Essene initiate. But they were very well known. Like, if you read Josephus, the Wars of the Jews, Philo's Every Good Man is Free, they go into great length descriptions of the Essenes and their incredible abilities, that they even say that like kings and noblemen and lords from far lands would call Essenes to their community and to their palace or whatever, if they had a sickness or a disease, because they were known far and wide for being incredible healers. Or they would travel to the Qumran Valley to be healed by the Essenes, and the Essenes would heal everybody that came to them as part of their ministry. And so they had this amazing reputation where, whether it's Persian kings, Greek lords and rulers, even the Romans talked very highly about the Essenes. It's like, hey, these guys are the Jews we like. You know, they're not the loud, angry ones who tell us that we're evil all the time. These Jews, they keep to themselves. They're strict vegetarians. They heal everyone that comes to them. They make no strife. They don't believe in war. They have no poverty in their society, no corruption. Like, what's not to like? You know, these are awesome people. So they were very well loved. And the pagan Christian movement that Paul started quickly proliferated in Jerusalem and Israel after the crucifixion and all that, and really won out over Nazarene Christianity, which the 12 disciples and James, who Jesus appointed as his leader, Jesus said, my brother James is going to lead this movement once I'm gone. And he said, no other person can lead my movement. Jesus said, no other person. So that excludes Paul, right? They were the Nazarene Christians, which they were also called the followers of the way. And this is in the Bible and all over first century literature. They were called the followers of the way, or the way of the law. And in the book of Acts, I think chapter 24, there's this really amazing passage that just puts a nail in the coffin, that the first Jesus movement was not Paul's movement. It was the Essene movement, the Nazarene movement of the 12 disciples and James, who were teaching the way of the law like the Essenes taught. And in the book of Acts, Paul gets called before the Jewish Sanhedrin, and they're accusing him of being the ringleader of the Jesus movement. And they say, is it true that you are the ringleader of the Nazarene movement, which they call a sect? And Paul responds and says, it is true. I am a follower of the way, which they call a sect. So he admits, he actually lies because he wasn't. He was, just before his conversion, he was trying to kill the Nazarene movement, and he was killing the Jewish Christians that were just following Jesus. And that's why Jesus comes to Paul, Saul at the time, on the road to Damascus and says, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Paul is thrown off his horse, and there's this bright, blinding light. And he says, who are you, Lord? And he says, I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are persecuting. The Nazar Essene, right? So we had these two movements, and Paul's won out because guess what? Paul's gospel is way, way more controllable and weaponizable for power. To say, hey, if you don't confess this one guy as Lord and Savior, you're going to burn in hell and you're a heretic and you're evil. I mean, that's the most controllable religion you could possibly invent. Jesus' actual gospel, which is love your neighbor as yourself and do no harm and obey the law and be righteous. You can't control people with that gospel. So Rome didn't want that Nazarene gospel. And that's where the story of the Essenes gets kind of sad, because there was this censorship campaign, the greatest censorship campaign probably ever, to censor out James and the disciples from church history and institute Paul as the father of Christianity and make him the figurehead. And that's what they did, is they burned all the Nazarene texts, which thankfully we have a small portion of them today, and we can read about what they were actually like in teaching. We have like the Didache is a Nazarene text written by the disciples, a bunch of other ones I could name. But they were burning these books to get them wiped out, and they were killing Nazarene Christians. And so the year before the Council of Nicaea, where they put the Bible together, in 364 AD, the year before that, they had the Council of Laodicea. And at that council, the Romans, the Roman Pope and I can't remember the ruler of Rome at that time's name, but they made an official decree that it is illegal now to be caught practicing Nazarene Christianity. And isn't that weird to make a decree that if you practice Nazarene Christianity, you'll be put to death? I thought Jesus was a Nazarene. He was called Jesus the Nazarene, but we're putting to death Nazarenes? Something's not adding up here, right? It was a coup d'etat of Jesus's gospel to censor it out and get it out, because it's the most like anti-authority gospel ever. You cannot make an authority figure out of Jesus who says, love everyone and love your neighbor. You have to have an angry, wrathful God of some sort to put fear into people. So basically, the Nazarenes were surviving from, 70 AD through 364. And there was many attempts they got kicked out of Jerusalem at like 150 AD, but they kept on proliferating around the outskirts and teaching the Nazarene gospel of Jesus, the way of the law, the Essene gospel. But because they were a thorn in the side of the pagan Christians, Paul's gospel, the pagan Christians, the Greek Christians, eventually started infighting and killing Jewish Christians until eventually Rome was like, let's just make it illegal and be done with it. And so that's kind of the last we see of the Essenes in 364 AD in history. But there's great evidence that they splintered off, and one faction of them became the Rastafarians. One faction went to Ethiopia, and that actually was the root of the Rastafarian movement. Another became a sect called the Ebionites. And then there's a third sect that's traced back from the Essenes that I'm blanking on, but they still do survive. They survived in small ways through transmuting themselves into other sects. But the Essene movement to me is really coming back now in today's day and age, that we're waking up to this incredible mystical Kabbalistic sect of Jews that Jesus came from. And the amazing teachings they had are just now coming back to the collective consciousness. And I think that's for a very important reason, because of the time that we're living in. Jesus was living in a time also where Rome was about to kill and overthrow the Jews, which happened in 70 AD. They sacked Jerusalem and slaughtered 1.1 million Jews overnight. They were living under this system of darkness, and they were very vocal about it, of, hey, the age of darkness is about to come to an end. There's going to be a new turning of the earth now. And aren't we at that same point right now where the kingdom of darkness is coming to a head and it's about to be overthrown? But we got to get through that apocalypse first, which we're kind of living through now. It makes sense that the Essenes and their teachings would be resurfacing now after 2,000 years.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I think of A Course in Miracles being channeled, was it in the 60s, right? The
70s, yeah.
The time that it's taken for it to, because to me, there's a direct connection to the Essene teachings, right? Jesus's teachings through A Course in Miracles, and how it's, percolating now. I mean, really, it's become so many more people around the world are familiar with A Course in Miracles, which, as we talked about, is so connected. And it's so interesting when I think of, if we were, and maybe some point I will be able to channel Jesus. I don't know if I were to ask, because I always be like, can I ask you a question? My sense is we would put religion labels, like put them off to the side. Put them away. Because in the end, you said this, it's natural law. It's love your neighbor as yourself. It's so simple. It is unconditional love. And that, to me, like, that is what we are here to embody, to learn, to practice. And without going too much into this, I've done a lot of, had a lot of interest in Mary Magdalene, as well as a keeper of this all the way.
Also an Essene?
Yes, an Essene who brought it to the south to France and to Spain, back there. And I know many here who are connected to her and her teachings, and just getting, I guess the point is, today we're seeing similar strife and that darkness up in our face. The shadow is here, and each of us can do something big time. And the answer is actually what we've been talking about, what you've been saying, staying in your heart, forgiveness, stopping your judgment, and starting with yourself. Is exactly what you said, Aaron. You cannot give away what you don't have. And so I'm so grateful. This was the conversation my heart has been wanting to have, because
nice.
We can do this. I know empowerment was the solar plexus chakra, and that empowerment, to me, there's an important aspect when it's empowered of divine love and powering up in divine light, in divine love. That helps us get into our heart. That was the third, moving to the fourth.
Yeah, absolutely. Like somebody who's stuck in the sacral, for example, they don't have that willpower yet to make something of themselves. A lot of like teenagers or guys in their 20s and 30s, like they just sit at home, play video games, smoke pot. That's somebody who hasn't really activated their solar plexus yet, because our solar plexus gives us that willpower to go become something in the world, make something of our life, make our life into something bigger than just ourselves, whether it's starting a business or whatever. You want to do something in the world. And that's the prerequisite to wanting to become loving and forgiving, is that you've got to start taking your own empowerment back and saying, like, I'm meant for something greater. And that I'm meant for something greater feeling we all have eventually leads us to the awareness of our oneness with the universe. And that gives us the impetus to become love and to live from the heart. So yeah, all the chakras, they're all equally valid and equally divine. It's not like the lower three are bad, and the upper three are good. The lower three are the foundation of who and what we are. And there is no spiritual progression without those lower three being balanced. So we have to love those aspects of ourselves. The root chakra, primal animal part of us that needs to survive and reproduce. Love that part of me. It's beautiful. It's divine. The personal aspect of me that has certain personal wants and needs, that's beautiful and divine. The part of me that wants to be something in the world and achieve things and have a dream and a destiny and be in the world and be in relationship to others, also beautiful and divine. And when we love those three elements of ourselves, we have the foundation we need to actually and finally get into that fourth chakra and begin to live from there.
Amen. My soul brother, that is, I was going to ask if you have any other heart flares, as we call them, and I'll give you a moment.
Nice.
That felt like drop the mic. Yeah. Right,
that was my heart flare for sure.
Yeah. I'm like, that's it. I'm going to do my little, there we go.
Nice.
Heart's coming. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yours actually did it.
I know. I don't know what this
Come on, that's a good heart. Look at that.
No, you have a really good heart. There's some
What's going on?
I'll show you after.
I'm too integrated,
Yeah. You don't even need the hearts. Right. You don't even need them.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I seriously, from my heart, from all of our hearts to yours, thank you. This conversation, so beyond spiritually nourishing. And I know, the intention in the beginning, may this be a blessing. That's kind of where I'm always coming from. May this be a blessing. May this bless everyone who's listening. And I want to thank you, Aaron, for being a blessing in my life, for being a blessing on the planet to so many millions of people. And I also want to thank you to our beloved listeners, to our community. You are a blessing. We've never done 2 hours. You are like, this is awesome. So you're a blessing. Even if you had a pause, it's all good. You are. We didn't have to do anything to be that. You're inherently that. And I just want to thank you.
Well, Julie, thank you so much for having me back on. Always a pleasure hanging out and talking with you. And you just ask the best questions and get me fired up. So what is this, our third podcast now? I
want to say it's our fifth, I think.
No way.
Yeah, because every time this is what happens. You come on and I'm like, I have 15,000 more questions for Aaron. And I'm like, all right, let me compose myself. Let me get them together. We'll find a new time. It's the fourth or fifth. I'll find out. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Wow. Well, whether it's third, fourth, or fifth time, it's always a pleasure to be back with you. And I can't wait to do it again.
Thank you. And you will be back. He will be back, my friends. We're sending so much love to you. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for choosing, if you so choose, I'd imagine if you're here, to be the 51% of being of service and positive polarity and frankly forgiving and living in your heart. May you know you're a blessing. May you live that you're a blessing. May you be love and be that blessing.
Aho.
My friend, I'm so grateful and honored to be here with you on your journey and being your USU. Thank you for watching this episode, for being part of this incredible community and this mission to really step into your light, to your highest purpose. I believe that as we all do that, we all can really be our best selves and uplift consciousness and in humanity. So thank you. I also wanted to say that if you are looking for greater support right now, maybe you're having a health concern or you're looking to really step into that next version, best version of yourself, please come connect with me, whether it's for more resources or coaching or guidance. I would love to support you in any way that I can. Just go to juliereisler.com. You can book a powerful one-on-one breakthrough session there. You can connect with me. I would love to meet you. I'd love to hear how I can be on this journey with you. And before I forget, if you'd like a little more of this good vibe tribe and would like to digest these episodes with a high vibe community, just go to Facebook and look up the USU podcast community. You'll find us there. Love always. And thank you so much for taking the time and energy to truly stepping into your authenticity and being your USU.